Picture this: a crisp autumn evening in the 1400s, the air thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts and damp earth. A crowd gathers in the town square, their faces flickering in the torchlight as they settle onto rough wooden benches. They've come for a play, a simple retelling of a familiar biblical story. But what unfolds on that makeshift stage will be anything but ordinary. By dawn, this performance will ignite a rebellion so fierce, it will topple local rulers and echo through the corridors of power for centuries. This isn't just a tale of art, it's proof that stories can be dangerous, that words, when spoken with enough conviction, can shake the very foundations of authority. Theater in the medieval world wasn't merely entertainment, it was a mirror held up to society, reflecting its flaws, its injustices, and its unspoken tensions. Plays were one of the few spaces where ordinary people could see their struggles dramatized, where the voiceless could, for a moment, speak through the characters on stage. And on that fateful night, the lines between actor and audience, between fiction and reality, blurred beyond recognition. What began as a scene about oppression became a rallying cry. The crowd didn't just watch, they rose. Why does this moment matter? Because it reveals a truth we often forget. Creativity isn't just about beauty or escape. It's a weapon, a tool, a spark. The rebellion that night didn't happen because of a battle cry or a political manifesto. It happened because a group of performers dared to tell a story that resonated too deeply. Over the next few minutes, we'll unravel how a seemingly harmless play became the match that lit a revolution. You'll discover the hidden power of art in a world of strict hierarchies, how laughter and drama can mask subversion, and why those in power have always feared the stage as much as the sword. This is the story of how a medieval play didn't just entertain history, it changed it forever. To understand why this particular play became so explosive, we need to step into the world of medieval performance. Picture a bustling market square, no velvet curtains or raised stages, just a patch of open ground where actors performed with little more than a few props and their own raw energy. These weren't professional actors in the modern sense. They were butchers, bakers, even monks, stepping into roles that let them speak truths they could never utter in their daily lives. The plays themselves were often rooted in religious stories, but the cleverest performers wove in sly jabs at local lords, corrupt clergy, or unfair taxes, always just subtle enough to avoid outright punishment. What made these performances so dangerous was their accessibility. Unlike books which required literacy or sermons which came from the pulpit, theater was for everyone. A peasant who couldn't read a single word could still grasp the satire when an actor playing a greedy bishop stuffed his pockets with fake coins. Laughter was the disguise, a way to let the audience in on the joke while keeping authorities guessing. And in an era when direct criticism could mean imprisonment or worse, the stage became a rare space where dissent could breathe. But this play, the one that sparked the rebellion, was different. It didn't just hint at injustice, it stripped away the metaphor. The actors portrayed a tyrannical ruler so blatantly modeled on the local lord that no one could miss the connection. And when the character met his dramatic downfall, the crowd didn't just cheer. They recognized something in that moment, not just a story, but a possibility. The line between fiction and reality had always been thin in medieval theater, but on that night it vanished entirely. The performance ended, but the energy in the square didn't fade. It simmered, then boiled over. By sunrise, the rebellion had begun, not with a sword stroke, but with a scene. The shepherd's revolt might have looked like just another morality play to the untrained eye, a simple retelling of biblical shepherds standing up against a cruel overlord. But the moment the first actor stepped onto that dirt stage, the crowd leaned in. They knew this wasn't just scripture. The villain, a pompous landowner named Lord Wolsey, bore an uncanny resemblance to their own lord, down to the trademark fur-lined cloak he wore while raising taxes. Every exaggerated gesture, every sneering line about the peasant's duty to fill his betters' coffers, landed like a spark on dry tinder. What made the script so explosive wasn't just its satire, it was its timing. The harvest had been poor that year. Families were stretching thin meals further, while the local lord hosted lavish feasts. When the play's shepherds finally threw off their chains, the audience didn't just see actors. They saw a blueprint the actors had woven in local details, a mocked-up version of the hated grain tax, a jab at the lord's hunting parties that trampled crops, and the recognition in the crowd was instant. Laughter turned to murmurs, then to shouts. By the final act, when the shepherds stormed Lord Wolsey's mock castle, the energy in the square wasn't just theatrical. It was alive. Historians still debate how much was scripted and how much erupted in the moment. Some claim the actors ad-libbed, riling the crowd further. Others insist the rebellion was always the plan, a performance meant to spill beyond the stage. What's certain is that by midnight, the torches weren't just lighting the play. They were lighting the march to the Lord's actual gates. The actors, still in costume, led the way. Fiction had given the crowd something rare: permission. If shepherds could revolt in a story, why not them? This wasn't just a play with a message, it was a play that became a moment. The tools of theater, exaggeration, disguise, the safe distance of fiction had been weapons all along. And when the audience realized they weren't just spectators but characters in their own story, the real performance began. That night, the actors didn't just break the fourth wall, they shattered it. What started as a few bold ad-libs naming the local tax collector and the bishop's greedy steward sent a shockwave through the crowd. The air crackled with something more than excitement. It was recognition. Every added detail, every stolen line from real life turned the play from allegory into accusation. When one actor threw aside his script and shouted, "Why should we pretend? The real thieves stand among us." The square erupted. Torches were knocked over, benches overturned. The performance had given the crowd something terrifyingly simple: a target. Authorities scrambled to contain the chaos, but they underestimated the power of a story that had slipped its leash. The play's fictional rebellion, a tidy tale of shepherds overthrowing a tyrant, had been a safe fantasy moments earlier. Now it was a roadmap. Townspeople tore props from the stage, repurposing wooden swords and makeshift banners as real weapons. The actors, caught between fear and exhilaration, found themselves swept into the mob they'd helped create. Some fled, others, still in costume, became reluctant leaders. The line between performer and protester blurred until it disappeared entirely. What made this riot different from other outbursts of frustration was its borrowed narrative. The crowd wasn't just angry, they were scripted. They chanted lines from the play as they marched. They mimicked the shepherds' triumphant storming of the castle, but now the castle gates were real. The rebellion had a rhythm, a borrowed theatricality that made it feel inevitable, even righteous. Historians would later note the eerie precision of the uprising's first hours, how quickly the mob organized, how efficiently they bypassed the Lord's defenses. It was as if the play had rehearsed them for this moment. By dawn, the town square stood empty, littered with trampled costumes and broken props, but the rebellion had legs. News of the players' revolt spread to neighboring villages not through couriers or decrees, but through retellings. People who hadn't even seen the play adopted its language, its symbolism. Within days, other troops were performing variations of the same story, each iteration bolder than the last. Authorities banned public gatherings, but the genie was out of the bottle. The stage had proven something dangerous, that fiction could be a contagion, and once an idea wore the cloak of a good story, it was almost impossible to contain. The morning after the riot, the town awoke to something unprecedented, not just destruction, but purpose. What had been raw fury in the torchlight now took shape as something far more dangerous, a movement. The play's catchy slogans, once lines in a script, were scrawled on walls and chanted in the streets. "Why pretend" became a battle cry. "The real thieves stand among us," turned into a refrain shouted at tax collectors' doors, and the shepherd's fictional victory. It was now a blueprint. Peasants who'd never dared speak back to their lords gathered in hushed groups, drafting lists of demands scrawled on scraps of parchment. They weren't just angry, they were specific: lower grain taxes, an end to forced labor on church lands, punishment for the bailiff who'd seized a widow's cow over unpaid dues. These weren't the vague grumblings of a hungry mob. They were the grievances of people who'd seen their struggles mirrored onstage and realized change was possible. The play had done more than inflame, it had educated. It showed them how to frame their pain as injustice, not inevitability. Words spread like sparks in dry grass. Traveling merchants who'd paused to watch the performance days earlier carried news of the uprising to neighboring villages. But they didn't just recount events, they performed snippets of the play at inns and crossroads, complete with mocking imitations of Lord Wolsey's swagger. Each retelling sharpened the rebellion's message, turning local complaints into a shared cause. By week's end, villages 20 miles away were burning effigies of their own lords, chanting the play's lines as if they'd written them themselves. The authorities' fatal mistake was dismissing the rebellion as mere theater, a flash of peasant emotion that would fizzle out. They sent a handful of soldiers to arrest the actors, assuming without the performers, the movement would collapse. But the actors weren't the rebellion anymore. They were just its first voice. The real force came from the butcher who'd played a shepherd and now organized supply chains for protest camps. The baker's wife who'd sewn costumes, stitched banners bearing the play's emblem, a broken chain. The rebellion had outgrown its stage. What stunned the nobility most wasn't the violence, but the coordination. Rebels used the play's fictional tactics in reality, setting up mock checkpoints to seize tax carts just as the shepherds had in the story. They even adopted the actors' trick of disguise, dressing as monks to slip past guards. The play hadn't just inspired rage, it had taught strategy. And as the first noble manners went up in flames, the lords realized too late that they weren't fighting a mob. They were fighting a story, and stories, once unleashed, are the hardest thing in the world to kill. The local lords made their first fatal mistake. They laughed. When news reached them that a band of peasants had taken up arms after watching some traveling players, they dismissed it as a drunken brawl blown out of proportion. Their response was almost casual: a dozen soldiers sent to round up the actors, a few public whippings to remind the rabble of their place. But the crackdown didn't extinguish the rebellion, it poured oil on the flames. What the lords failed to grasp was that this wasn't just a riot anymore. The rebels had adopted the play's language so completely that punishment felt like validation. When soldiers dragged away the actor who'd played Lord Wolsey, the crowd didn't scatter, they erupted. The arrest became a scene straight from the performance, proof that life was imitating art. Overnight, the rebels stopped being a disorganized mob. They began organizing in secret, using the play's structure as their guide. The shepherds in the story had formed a council to debate tactics. Now, real-life villagers did the same in candlelit barns. Satire became their sharpest weapon. They couldn't match the nobility's arms or armor, but they could outmaneuver them with ridicule. When the lord's tax collectors came demanding grain, they were greeted by peasants wearing crude paper crowns, reciting the play's most mocking line. Puppet shows in market squares caricatured the local bishop as a gluttonous fox. Each act of defiance was a performance, calculated to humiliate while avoiding outright treason. The lords could punish individuals, but how do you arrest an idea that's already spread to every tavern and field? Then came the miscalculation that turned rebellion into revolution. Desperate to reassert control, the nobility ordered the play band not just performed but mentioned. Anyone caught whispering its lines would lose their tongue. The effect was explosive. Suddenly, the rebellion wasn't just about grain taxes or unfair labor. It was about who had the right to tell stories. Peasants who'd hesitated to join now saw the stakes. If they couldn't even speak about injustice, how could they ever challenge it? Leadership emerged from unexpected places. A dyer's apprentice who'd played a minor shepherd became the rebellion's chief strategist, adapting the play's fictional tactics to real sieges. A widow who'd sewn costumes now organized supply networks, using her knowledge of backroads to smuggle food to rebel camps. Even the play's original author, a defrocked monk hiding in the hills, began drafting proclamations that blended scripture with satire, turning each new decree into a weapon. The lords kept waiting for the rebellion to collapse under its own chaos. Instead, it grew more disciplined, more creative. Soldiers expecting pitchforks found themselves outwitted by clever ruses straight from the stage. Decoy armies made of straw figures, fake desertions that lured patrols into ambushes. The rebels weren't just fighting for bread anymore. They were fighting to prove that the story they'd helped create, one where the powerless could triumph, wasn't fiction after all. And that terrified the nobility more than any army, because you can crush men, you can burn villages, but how do you kill a story that's already been told? Martin the Red didn't look like a revolutionary. With his ink-stained fingers and a voice trained for projecting to back rows, not battlefields, he seemed more suited to parchment than pikes. Yet when he climbed onto an overturned cart to address the rebels, something extraordinary happened. The crowd didn't just listen, they recognized him. Not as a stranger, but as the man who'd given them the words they'd been too afraid to say. His speeches weren't mere rallying cries, they were extensions of the play, full of its biting satire and biblical cadence. He framed their fight not as treason but as a divine reckoning, a story where they weren't criminals but heroes. What made Martin dangerous wasn't his sword arm, it was his grasp of symbolism. While other rebels sharpened blades, he sharpened metaphors. When the nobility branded them lawless bandits, Martin staged a midnight performance outside the bishop's palace, with rebels dressed as angels casting out, an actor playing the greed-drunk tax collector. It was theater as warfare, turning the church's own imagery against it. Soon, villagers began calling the rebellion the shepherd's judgment, lifting phrases straight from Martin's scripts to justify their actions. Even those who couldn't read could quote his speeches verbatim, passing them along like folk songs. The rebellion's tactics borrowed heavily from the stage. Martin organized processions, part protest, part street theater, where rebels reenacted scenes of the Lord's abuses while distributing bread to the poor. When soldiers approached, the performers would scatter, only to regroup elsewhere and begin again. These spectacles weaponized shame, exposing corruption in ways that resonated deeper than any pamphlet. The nobility could dismiss angry peasants, but how could they counter a widow kneeling in the mud, reenacting how her son was conscripted, while a chorus chanted scripture about justice? Yet Martin's greatest insight was that every rebellion needs not just leaders, but characters, roles people could step into. the hesitant farmer became the steadfast shepherd when handed a wooden crook. The timid weaver transformed into the truth-telling prophetess when handed a scroll of demands. These weren't empty titles, they were narrative armor, granting ordinary people the courage to act as their bolder selves. Soon, villagers had their own Martin the Red's local bards and outspoken craftsmen who adapted his words to their grievances, weaving in details about stolen livestock or crooked bailiffs. The rebellion stopped being one man's message and became a chorus, but charisma alone couldn't topple castles. As the movement grew, Martin faced his hardest role yet, strategist. He pored over stolen maps with a former stagehand who'd built siege engines for play battles, now modifying them for real ones. Costume designers sewed tunics that let rebels blend into monastery processions, while actors trained scouts to mimic noble accents for gathering intelligence. Every theatrical skill became a weapon. When the Lord's army finally marched, they didn't find a disorganized rabble, but a force that moved like a well-rehearsed tragedy, complete with feigned retreats, dramatic ambushes, and a finale where the rebels seized the granary not by brute force, but by convincing the guards they were players performing a mask. The nobles scoffed at these theatrics right up until their own soldiers began deserting, lured by the rebellion's compelling story. Why serve a cruel lord when you could star in a better one? Martin understood what the aristocracy never could, that the battle wasn't just for land or bread, but for the narrative itself. And in that contest, the side with the better story, the one that made shepherds into saints and tax collectors into devils, held the real power. When the rebellion finally forced the nobility to negotiate, it wasn't because of superior arms. It was because Martin's story had reached the one audience that mattered: history itself. And history, as any playwright knows, loves a good underdog. The rebellion's genius lay in its portability. A script could be smuggled in a hay cart, memorized by a traveling minstrel, or whispered between market stalls. By the time the nobility grasped the scale of the threat, a dozen villages had staged their own versions of the incendiary play. In one town, the villain became a miller who hoarded grain. In another, a conniving bailiff who falsified land deeds. Each performance ended the same way, with a crowd no longer content to applaud, but to act. What began as a single spark in one town square became a constellation of fires across the region. Authorities responded with textbook suppression tactics and failed spectacularly. Their first mistake was attacking the messengers. When soldiers burned a troop's wagons and costumes, they only cemented the actors' status as martyrs. Villagers who'd hesitated to join now saw fresh parallels between the play's oppressed shepherds and their own punished neighbors. The second misstep was underestimating the rebellion's adaptability. Banning public gatherings, rebels staged farmers' almanac readings that seamlessly segued into protest songs. Confiscating scripts, the lines spread orally, mutating into rhymes children sang while skipping rope. Every crackdown bred 10 new forms of dissent. The nobility's most catastrophic error was assuming the rebellion required leaders to decapitate. When they arrested Martin the Red, they expected chaos. Instead, they created 100 imitators, a seamstress in one town rewriting the play to feature weavers, a charcoal burner in another turning its verses into work chants. Without a central figure, the movement became Hydra-headed. Even the church's attempts to co-opt the rebellion backfired. A bishop's decree that the play be performed properly, with the shepherds repenting their revolt, only inspired peasants to heckle the revised performances with the original's rebel lines. What truly terrified the establishment was how thoroughly fiction had reshaped reality. Tax collectors found villages eerily empty on arrival, their inhabitants coincidentally reenacting the play's evasion tactics in nearby woods. Deserting soldiers quoted the shepherd's oaths when switching sides. The rebellion didn't just borrow theater's stories, it absorbed its methods. Ambushes unfolded with dramatic timing. Propaganda scrolls used rhyming couplets for memorability. Even surrender negotiations became performative, with rebels staging elaborate tableaus of justice before accepting terms. By the time the nobility considered concessions, they weren't just battling rebels, they were trapped inside a story they couldn't rewrite. Every punitive measure added another villainous chapter to the narrative. Every broken promise became a plot twist fueling the next act. When the First Lords finally knelt to sign reforms, they weren't just conceding to men with pitchforks. They were bowing to something far more powerful, a story that had outgrown its stage, its actors, even its authors. Because once an idea wears the skin of myth, not even fire can erase it. The nobles' council chamber echoed with shouting as the rebellion's flames licked closer to their gates. On one side stood the old duke, his jowls trembling as he slammed a fist onto the table. Burn their villages, hang the ringleaders in the square. Across from him, the younger baroness folded her arms. And when half the harvest goes unplanted because we've killed the laborers. Who feeds your army then? This wasn't just disagreement, it was paralysis. Every day they spent debating was another day the rebellion story spread, its roots digging deeper into the land. What the nobles failed to realize was how transparent their divisions had become. Rebel spies, former stable boys, and scullery maids leaked every furious argument from the castle halls. Soon, the rebellion's playwrights wove these rifts into their street performances, one actor playing a squabbling lord and lady while another sneaked off with their treasure chest. The message was clear: the mighty weren't just cruel, they were clumsy, and nothing erodes fear faster than mockery. Meanwhile, the rebels turned noble hesitation into opportunity. While lords bickered over tactics, rebellion envoys slipped into merchant guild halls and monastery scriptoriums, offering deals. To the wool traders choked by noble tariffs, they promised open roads. To reformist monks appalled by the church's excesses, they framed their fight as a holy purge of corruption. These weren't just alliances, they were narrative coups. When a famed preacher declared the rebellion, a trial sent by God to chasten the proud, even pious grandmothers began hiding rebel fugitives. But the rebellion's boldest stroke came when they weaponized the nobility's own propaganda. For years, lords had claimed their rule was divinely ordained until rebel scribes scribbled in the margins. They distributed altered broadsheets where biblical verses condemning greed appeared beside lists of the Lord's stolen grain. They staged midnight miracles in village squares, actors dressed as angels revealing fake tax records hidden in church altars. The spectacle wasn't just convincing, it was contagious. Soon, real priests began discovering damning documents of their own, either from genuine belief or fear of being left behind. The nobles' final undoing was their refusal to see the rebellion as more than a peasant tantrum. When rebel leaders proposed terms, the council splintered further. Hardliners saw negotiation as weakness. Pragmatists warned that winter was coming, and empty granaries bred more rebels than any play ever could. Their indecision became a script the rebellion wrote in real time. Hesitant lords cast as fools in a comedy of errors, while the rebels polished their own legend. By the time the first snow fell, the question wasn't whether the nobility would fracture, but who would be left standing when the pieces stopped falling. And in the wings, the rebellion's playwrights sharpened their quills for the next act. If lords thought the story would end with concessions, they'd misread the genre. This wasn't a morality play where everyone learned their lesson. It was a revolution, and revolutions don't fade to black, they burn the stage down. The castle gates had never looked so fragile. For generations, those iron-bound timbers had stood as a symbol of unshakable power until the morning rebel torches lit up the pre-dawn fog, their glow revealing cracks the defenders had never noticed. This wasn't just any fortress, it was the same castle where, in the Shepherd's Revolt, the fictional shepherds had toppled their oppressor with little more than righteous fury and farming tools. Now life was mirroring art with terrifying precision. Peasants who'd spent their lives hauling stone for noble walls used that same knowledge to find weak points. Blacksmiths reforged plowshares into grappling hooks. Even the rebels' battle cries came straight from the play's climactic scene. The shepherd's crook breaks the wolf's teeth. What made the siege so devastating wasn't just its success, it was its symbolism. When the first rebels breached the inner courtyard, they didn't just find stores of grain and weapons. They discovered the Lord's private theater, its stage still set for an upcoming performance of all things, a comedy about foolish peasants. The irony wasn't lost on the rebels. By nightfall, that same stage hosted a very different show. A hastily rewritten version of the Shepherd's Revolt performed for cheering soldiers, its rewritten ending now starring the castle's real-life steward as the groveling villain. The message was clear, fiction had become fact. News of the castle's fall traveled faster than any courier. In neighboring fiefdoms, nobles who dismissed the rebellion as a passing nuisance now barricaded themselves in their halls, suddenly eager to negotiate. But the rebels understood what their opponents did not. This wasn't just about lowering taxes anymore. The siege had exposed something far more dangerous, the flimsy illusion of noble invincibility. When word spread that farmers and cobblers had taken a fortress without siege engines or knights, it shattered centuries of social order in a single afternoon. The negotiations that followed were less a dignified parliament than a theatrical spectacle in their own right. Rebel delegates arrived wearing patched-together versions of noble garb, a deliberate mockery of aristocratic pomp. They demanded terms that went beyond grain prices, insisting on public trials for corrupt bailiffs, village councils with real authority, even the right to perform plays without censorship. Each clause was framed not as a request but as a scene from an unfolding drama. Let the record show, began one rebel scribe, that on this day the shepherds wrote their own ending. What terrified the nobility most wasn't the demands themselves, but the language in which they were couched. The rebels spoke of justice as if it were a character in their story, one long overdue for an entrance. When a count scoffed that peasants couldn't possibly understand law, a young woman from the rebel delegation stood and recited, word perfect, the castle's own charter from memory, then pointed out where its promises had been broken. She'd learned the text not from scrolls, but from a scene in the play where a shepherd outwits a scheming lawyer. The room fell silent. By the time the quills scratched across the final treatise, something fundamental had shifted. The rebellion hadn't just won concessions, it had rewritten the rules of power itself. No longer could authority rest solely on birthright or brute force. Now it had to contend with something far more unpredictable, the power of a story that refused to stay on the page. As the last noble seals were pressed into wax, one rebel actor turned to another and whispered the line that would echo through history, "Careful, my lord." The play's not over, it's only just begun. The ink on the treatise was barely dry when the first betrayal came. Under pressure, many nobles had signed documents promising lower taxes, fairer courts, even village councils with real authority. But old habits die hard, especially when power is at stake. Within weeks of returning to their estates, several lords quietly reinstated the old grain levies, counting on the rebels' disorganization to prevent unified resistance. What they underestimated was how thoroughly the play had schooled the peasants in spotting deception. When a bailiff in one village tried to collect the forbidden heritage tax, the farmers didn't just refuse, they reenacted the exact courtroom scene from the Shepherds' Revolt, complete with a child playing the role of the corrupt judge. The performance wasn't just protest, it was a public shaming that spread faster than the tax itself. Yet not all nobles resisted change. A handful of younger lords, some who'd secretly watched rebel performances from the shadows, recognized the tide was turning. Baroness Allay of the Northern Marches shocked her peers by not just honoring the reforms, but expanding them, abolishing serfdom on her lands and inviting elected village spokesmen to her council table. Her reasoning was pragmatic. Better to share a loaf than lose the oven. Her estates became islands of uneasy peace, where former rebels now patrolled the roads alongside her soldiers. But these exceptions only deepened the rebellion's central dilemma. Could any noble's word be trusted, or was compromise itself a trap? The movement fractured along this fault line. Moderates argued that partial victories should be celebrated, that pushing further might provoke brutal reprisals. Hardliners, many of them actors and scribes who'd honed their rhetoric onstage, countered that stopping now would betray the play's own lesson, that tyrants only yield when forced. The debate played out in makeshift meeting halls that echoed with dramatic quotations. One faction brandished the new treaties like scripts. "We have our lines, let us speak them." The other tore copies in half, shouting, "The third act isn't written yet." What saved the rebellion from implosion was an unexpected threat, not from the nobles but from the crown. King Edric had initially dismissed the uprising as a local squabble, until news reached him that rebel envoys were negotiating directly with foreign merchants, bypassing royal tariffs. Worse, his spies reported that performances of the Shepherds' Revolt were now being staged near his own border garrisons, complete with revised lyrics about kings who feast while soldiers starve. The rebellion was no longer just challenging landlords, it was flirting with treason. Edric's response was characteristically shrewd. Instead of sending armies, he dispatched bishops bearing pardons and promises of royal justice, but only for rebels who laid down arms immediately. The offer split villages down the middle. Some saw it as deliverance, others as the oldest trick in the noble playbook. The king's real masterstroke came next. A decree that all performances must now be licensed by the crown, with unapproved plays punishable by branding. It wasn't just censorship, it was a poisoned dart aimed at the rebellion's heart. Because without the stage, how would the shepherds tell their story? Yet the rebels had learned too much to retreat. When royal heralds arrived in one town to burn a troop's scripts, they found the square already packed with villagers, not armed but singing. The band play's lyrics had been set to a hymn tune, turning subversion into something the bishops couldn't touch: worship. By sundown, the melody was humming from every tavern. The king had miscalculated. You could ban a play, but you couldn't unmake a chorus. The church's public stance was thunderous in its condemnation. From every pulpit, bishops denounced the rebellion as the devil's work, a sinful disruption of the divine order. Official decrees warned that any peasant who took up arms risked eternal damnation. But in the shadowy corners of monasteries and the cramped back rooms of parish houses, a very different conversation was unfolding. Some priests kept well-worn copies of scripture open to specific passages: Isaiah's cries against oppressive rulers, James's warnings to wealthy landowners. These men had spent years comforting starving families while their abbots dined on silver plates. When rebels slipped into confessionals, they didn't always hear absolution denied. Sometimes they received whispered directions to safe houses or coded messages tucked inside prayer books. This duality tore the church apart. While high-ranking clergy allied with nobles, lowly parish priests often faced the rebellion's consequences firsthand. One friar's journal recounts how he wept while blessing rebel graves, knowing the dead had been his parishioners' children he'd baptized, couples he'd married. When his superior ordered him to preach obedience to the Lords, he instead crafted sermons filled with pointed parables about wicked tenants and righteous laborers, leaving his congregation to read between the lines. Such quiet defiance wasn't uncommon. In one town, nuns smuggled rebel messages inside hollowed-out loaves of communion bread. In another, a choir of monks deliberately sang off-key during a noble's visit, their discord a subtle protest. The rebellion's Playwright seized this tension. New scenes appeared where corrupt bishops clutched bags of gold while a humble friar fed the poor, a not-so-subtle nod to the church's internal divide. When authorities banned these performances, the rebels adapted. They staged miracles plays where saints denounced greed, or had actors deliver rebel lines while posing as biblical figures during religious festivals. The brilliance lay in plausible deniability. Was that really a rebel sympathizer playing the prophet Amos, or just an overzealous performer? Even bishops hesitant to support the rebellion balked at punishing what might be mere piety. Meanwhile, the rebellion's fate increasingly hinged on these ecclesiastical cracks. A well-timed sermon about the Good Samaritan could sway a village toward revolt. A fearful priest's warning might chill enthusiasm overnight. Both sides knew the stakes. When rebel leaders secured a secret meeting with a sympathetic cardinal, they didn't ask for weapons or gold. They begged for copies of the church's own social justice teachings to weaponize in their plays. The cardinal's response was telling. He gave them not just books, but a list of parishes where the wine would be left unguarded during the next festival. By the time the Pope issued a sweeping condemnation of the rebellion, it was too late. The genie of moral ambiguity had escaped. Peasants now quoted church fathers to justify disobedience. Deserting soldiers cited Thomas Aquinas on just rebellion. Even some clergy began openly questioning whether their loyalty lay with the hierarchy or the hungry. The rebellion had done more than challenge nobles. It had turned the church's own teachings into a mirror, forcing it to confront the gap between what it preached and what it tolerated. And in that reflection, the movement found its most powerful ally, not an army, but a crisis of conscience. The rebellion's most potent weapons weren't forged in smithies. They were scribbled on scraps of parchment, hummed in taverns, and performed on splintered cart beds. A single song could travel farther than a cavalry charge, carried by wandering minstrels and field workers alike. When authorities banned the shepherds' revolt, the rebels didn't retreat. They multiplied it. New versions sprouted like weeds, tailored to each village's grievances. In one town, the villain became a tax collector who stole wedding dowries. In another, a bishop who sold absolution for sacks of flour. Every performance ended with the same call to action, now woven into folk songs children sang while skipping rope. Why pretend? The chains are ours to break. Pamphlets, too, became bullets in this paper war. Illiterate, no matter. Rebel scribes illustrated them with woodcuts so vivid. A single glance told the story. Nobles feasting atop a mountain of bread while peasants gnawed on roots. These weren't just distributed, they were staged. A farmer might accidentally drop one in the market square, sparking a scramble that ended with a dozen hands clutching forbidden words. When soldiers raided a print shop in the dead of night, they found the press dismantled, and the next morning, handwritten copies of the same text appeared nailed to church doors. The harder the crackdown, the more ingenious the delivery, but the true stroke of genius was turning setbacks into propaganda. After a bloody skirmish where rebel lives were lost, the movement's poets transformed the fallen into symbols. Their names became verses in ballads, their last words woven into plays as heroic soliloquies. A defeat on the battlefield could be rewritten as a moral victory on the page, one where the martyr's sacrifice opened the people's eyes. Even captured rebels played their parts. At public executions, some sang the rebellion's anthem so loudly, the hangman's noose became a microphone. The crowd would leave not cowed, but chanting the lyrics under their breath. Authorities struck back with propaganda of their own, but their efforts reeked of desperation. Pamphlets warning of divine punishment for rebels were met with laughter, especially when villagers recognized the ink as coming from the same monastery that had overcharged for funeral rites. A noble's attempt to commission a rival play, The Loyal Ploughman, backfired spectacularly when the actor hired to play the virtuous peasant ad-libbed rebel slogans mid-performance. The audience's cheers drowned out the Lord's furious orders to stop the show. Yet for all its brilliance, the rebellion's cultural machine faced a looming question. Could songs and stories replace swords and grain? A starving weaver might find solace in a ballad, but would it fill her children's bellies? The rebels' answer was to weave practicality into their art. Plays now included coded instructions, a shepherd's counting song that taught listeners when and where to gather supplies, or a comic scene about a bumbling bailiff that secretly revealed which roads his patrols avoided. Even children's rhymes held maps, their nonsense syllables spelling out locations of hidden storehouses. The nobility's fatal error was dismissing this as mere entertainment. They failed to grasp that the rebellion's plays weren't just about morale, they were training tools. Every performance taught something: how to spot a spy, how to disguise messages in plain sight, even how to treat wounds using herbs mentioned in a healer's monologue. When a Lord's spy reported that rebels were wasting time rehearsing, he missed the truth. They weren't just preparing for a show, they were rehearsing for revolution. And so the war of words raged on, each side fighting not just for land, but for the narrative itself. Would history remember this as a peasant tantrum or a righteous uprising? The rebels bet everything on the latter, that if they could control the story, they could shape the future. Because once an idea takes root in enough minds, it doesn't need an army to survive. It just needs someone left to sing the chorus. The rebellion's triumph should have been a time of celebration, town squares draped in the colors of liberation, feasts where noble stockpiles fed the hungry, stages that once mocked tyrants now hosting debates about fair harvest shares. For a fleeting moment it was. Villagers who'd spent lifetimes bowing to bailiffs now sat on councils drafting laws. The same hands that had stitched rebellious banners sewed new ones, justice woven here. But the cracks began showing before the ink on those banners dried. Grain stores, looted from noble barns in the heady days of victory, dwindled faster than anyone anticipated. Without the Lord's brutal efficiency, or their whips, fields went untended as peasants debated planting schedules in endless meetings. Rebel guards assigned to protect granaries from loyalist raids sometimes misplaced sacks for their own families. The very idealism that fueled the uprising now hindered survival. When a farmer's child starved, no amount of poetic rhetoric about collective sacrifice could fill their belly. Whispers started. Were we freer under the whip or just better fed? Worse than hunger was the infighting. The rebellion had united shepherds and scribes, blacksmiths and monks, but against a common enemy, not around a common vision. Purists wanted to abolish all noble titles immediately. Pragmatists argued for gradual reform. Street theater troupes clashed with militia leaders over priorities. Should they stage another play exposing corruption or train more archers? Council chambers became stages themselves, with factions performing political maneuvers as elaborate as any scripted drama. Loyalist forces exploited this chaos masterfully. They didn't just attack rebel strongholds, they poisoned wells with rumors. A whispered lie about a council member hoarding cheese could unravel months of trust. A forged rebel proclamation ordering villagers to burn their own crops spread before anyone could debunk it. The nobles understood what some rebels still didn't, that governance wasn't just about laws but perception. Every misstep became a propaganda gift. When a rebel patrol accidentally trampled a wheat field, loyalist broadsheets depicted it as deliberate tyranny. Yet amid the stumbling, glimmers of something extraordinary emerged. In one town, a former weaver-turned-magistrate devised a lottery system for grain distribution that even loyalist spies admitted was fair. In another, actors and midwives collaborated on a revolutionary idea, traveling health troops that performed hygiene plays while distributing medicinal herbs. These experiments flickered like candles in a storm, proving the rebellion's ideals weren't naive, just untested. The cruelest twist came when rebel-held towns faced the same dilemmas as the nobles they'd overthrown. A village near the border caught smuggling grain to a loyalist area for double the price, forced the council into an unbearable choice: execute the smugglers as traitors, proving they'd become as merciless as the lords, or show mercy and risk appearing weak to desperate neighbors eyeing their own stores. The decision they made, public labor as repayment, satisfied no one. It was the first time some rebels wondered aloud whether power corrupted everyone eventually. By the time loyalist armies regrouped for their counteroffensive, the rebellion was already fracturing from within. Not from lack of courage, but from the sobering truth Martin the Red had scribbled in his final journal before his capture: "It is easier to play shepherds in a tale than to tend real sheep." The stages that had once fueled the uprising now hosted grim comedies about bumbling rebel bureaucrats written by the rebels themselves. Laughter still echoed, but it was heavier now, weighted with the knowledge that the hardest scenes weren't about overthrowing tyrants. They were about becoming something different, and in the shadows the nobility watched, waited, and rehearsed their next move. They'd learned from the rebellion's plays too, not about justice but timing. Let the rebels exhaust themselves trying to build utopia with empty granaries. Let them starve their own ideals. Then, when the curtain fell on this act, the lords would step back into the spotlight. Only this time there'd be no encore. The nobles struck when the rebellion was at its weakest, not with the clumsy brutality of their first reprisals, but with the cold precision of men who'd learned from their mistakes. Mercenary companies, paid with melted-down church silver, moved like shadows through the countryside. They didn't just attack rebel strongholds, they severed supply lines, poisoned wells, and spread rumors that turned neighbor against neighbor. Villages that had cheered the play's performances months earlier now barred their gates to strangers, fearing both royal punishment and rebel scavengers. The uprising's greatest strength, its decentralized nature, became its fatal flaw. Without a single head to cut off, the nobility resolved to burn the whole body. What made the counterattack so devastating wasn't just its violence, but its theatricality. Captured rebels weren't quietly hanged in dungeons, they were made into spectacles. A miller who'd organized grain redistribution was forced to wear his stolen lord's cloak to the gallows, the fur now crawling with lice. A teenage girl who'd sung rebel anthems had her tongue nailed to the tavern sign where she'd performed. These weren't just punishments, they were perverse performances designed to rewrite the rebellion's narrative. Where the shepherd's revolt had turned peasants into heroes, the nobles' executions aimed to reduce them back to fools and criminals. Yet the movement's core had always thrived underground. Actors who'd once played shepherds now disguised themselves as peddlers, stitching rebel messages into the linings of cloaks. A band song might surface as a lullaby in one village, a drinking chant in the next. Even the nobility's attempts to co-opt the rebellion's symbols backfired. When a count staged his own lavish loyalty play, depicting grateful peasants returning to their lords, Someone swapped the script at the last moment. The actors unwittingly performed the original rebel lines to a crowd that erupted in knowing laughter. The darkest nights of repression gave birth to the rebellion's most ingenious adaptations. With public gatherings banned, rebels turned funeral processions into covert meetings, mourners' wails masking whispered strategies. A blacksmith's rhythmic hammering might conceal the tapping of coded messages. Even children's games were weaponized. A hopping rhyme about the fox and the hare taught lookout signals for approaching soldiers. The nobles could burn villages, but they couldn't scorch away the stories now woven into daily life. What truly haunted the nobility wasn't the armed resistance, it was the quiet persistence of memory. A farmer might bow to his lord by day, but at night his family still mouthed the forbidden play's words over dying embers. A weaver's loom clicked out the rhythm of rebel songs under the guise of a work chant. The rebellion had taught an entire generation that words could be stronger than swords, and that lesson couldn't be unlearned. When a captured rebel was pressed to reveal his allies, he simply smiled and recited the play's final line. The curtain falls, but the house lights never fade. The executioner's axe was swift that day, but the story, as always, was slower to die. The rebellion didn't die when the torches dimmed and the stages fell silent. It simply slipped underground. In the back rooms of alehouses with false floors, under the pretense of midnight prayer gatherings, even in the rhythmic clatter of looms where coded messages were woven into cloth patterns, the movement learned to breathe differently. Former actors now wore the disguises of everyday life. A traveling tinker's cart hid rebel pamphlets beneath pots and pans. A butcher's stall became a drop point for intelligence wrapped in blood-soaked parchment. The play that once roared in town squares now whispered through coal cellars, performed for audiences of a dozen, their faces lit by a single candle's guttering flame. This shadow network thrived on ingenuity. A nursery rhyme about the fox and the geese carried troop movements when sung with the right inflection. Bakeries sold loaves stamped with tiny symbols across here, a star there marking safe houses or warning of spies. Even the rebellion's failures became lessons. When a loyalist informant infiltrated one cell, the survivors devised a new rule. No plan would be spoken aloud until it had been acted out first as a scene from an innocent-seeming morality play. If the dialogue felt wrong, the plot was scrapped. Theater, once their weapon, was now their armor. The rebellion's new leaders were a different breed, less fiery orators than patient weavers of trust. A former seamstress organized couriers by exploiting noble blindness, who would suspect the woman mending their shirts of carrying secrets in her thread spools. A monastery's wine steward who'd once played comic friars onstage smuggled messages inside hollowed-out casks. These weren't the bold faces of the uprising's early days, but they were perhaps more dangerous. They understood that lasting change wasn't about dramatic victories, but relentless persistence. And so the movement's heart kept beating, faint but steady. Children learned rebel songs as lullabies, their innocent voices masking sedition. Farmers planted crops in patterns that, seen from a hilltop, spelled out rallying cries. Even the nobility's attempts to erase the past backfired when they ordered every copy of the Shepherd's Revolt burned. Scribes reproduced it from memory, each version slightly altered, evolving like a living thing. The rebellion had shed its skin, but not its soul. Years later, when new revolts erupted in distant cities, the old tactics resurfaced. A heretic preacher's sermon echoed the play's structure. A weaver's strike used the same coded loom patterns. The rebellion's legacy wasn't just in the reforms it won or the blood it spilled. It was in proving that once an idea wears the cloak of story, it can slip past castle gates and prison bars alike. Authorities could crush men and burn books, but they could never unteach the lesson those shepherds had learned, that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is a story everyone knows by heart. The rebellion's flames may have been stamped out, but the embers glowed for generations. On the surface, the nobility reclaimed their lands, their titles, their right to rule, yet something fundamental had shifted. The lords who once taxed their subjects without a second thought now hesitated, glancing over their shoulders at the empty spaces where rebel stages once stood. In some regions, grain levies were quietly reduced by a third. Corrupt bailiffs found themselves dismissed overnight, their replacements warned to keep the shepherd's crooks in mind. Even the church tempered its demands, lest another actor rise to parody its excesses. The rebellion hadn't just won concessions, it had instilled a fear far more potent than any army, the memory of what happens when the powerless stop pretending. But the play's true victory wasn't in ledgers or laws, it was in language. Though authorities banned the shepherd's revolt by name, its lines seeped into the vernacular like rain into cracked earth. A farmer grumbling about Wolsey's share when taxes felt too heavy, a mother shushing her child with the rebel chant, "Hush, or the wolves will hear." Even nobles unwittingly quoted the script, their threats of teaching the rabble their place echoing the villain's doomed boasts. The phrases became a shadow language, a way to critique power without saying it outright. A lord might burn a pamphlet, but how could he punish a proverb? The rebellion's legacy lived brightest in the stories told far from castle ears. At harvest festivals, mummers performed the tale of the brave shepherds, careful to change just enough details to avoid the censors, yet every villager knew the truth. Grandparents who'd witnessed the uprising firsthand whispered its lessons to wide-eyed children, how a humble play had made tyrants flinch, how costumes could become armor, how laughter could be the sharpest sword. These weren't just memories, they were manuals. When a new lord in the Eastern Marches tried reviving an old serfdom law, his subjects didn't riot. They staged a historical pageant outside his gates, reenacting the downfall of Lord Wolsey with pointed precision. The law was repealed by sundown, yet the rebellion's most profound reach stretched beyond its birthplace. Traveling merchants carried its songs along trade routes, where they mutated into ballads about miners in the north and dockworkers in southern ports. A guildsman in a distant city, hearing the tale, penned his own satire about greedy masters and sparked a strike that shuttered the wool exchange for a month. Even the rebellion's failures became cautionary gold. When a neighboring duchy's peasants rose up decades later, their leaders studied the original revolt's missteps, avoiding its factional fights. The play had become a blueprint, adapted wherever people dreamed of bending the arc of power. And so, while the nobility could rebuild their castles and replant their fields, they could never fully reclaim the old order. The rebellion had planted a seed in the collective imagination. That authority wasn't a force of nature, but a performance one that required the audience's belief to sustain it. Every time a peasant smirked at a tax collector's bluster or a craftsman misheard an unjust order, the ghost of that long-ago play flickered to life. The lords still ruled, but now they did so on borrowed time, forever glancing at the crowd, wondering if today might be the night the applause turned to something far more dangerous. News of the uprising spread like a tune you can't stop humming, carried by merchants with pack mules, whispered between laundresses at the riverbank, even hummed by soldiers marching to crush the very revolts they unwittingly spread. By the time winter frosts thawed, villages 3 valleys over were staging their own versions of the shepherd's revolt, each performance tweaked to local grievances. A fishing hamlet's adaptation cast the villain as a tax collector who demanded a cut of every catch. A mining town's rewrite ended with the actors smelting their chains into pickaxes. The details varied, but the message never did. Oppression wasn't fate. It was a role that could be rewritten. Authorities reacted with predictable fury. Castle decrees banned unauthorized plays, then all gatherings of more than 5 people, then finally any seditious singing. But bans, it turned out, made terrible kindling. The more the nobility tried to smother the story, the more inventive its survival became. In one town, rebels staged a mock funeral procession for the late Lord Censorship, his coffin stuffed with torn edicts. In another, a blacksmith's apprentice hammered the play's most incendiary lines into plowshares, knowing every furrow they carved would whisper rebellion into the soil. The real shock wasn't just the revolts, it was their coordination. Though miles apart and leaderless, the uprisings moved with eerie synchronicity. A tax collector's house burned in one province on the same day, another was pelted with rotten fruit in the next. Historians later found scraps of correspondence between traveling actors, coded notes sewn into puppet heads, or baked into loaf ends, proving the rebellion had a nervous system. When a lord in the western foothills bragged he'd silenced his troublemakers, his own jesters performed a skit about a crow who thought it had swallowed the sunrise. The message was clear: you can't kill an idea by choking one voice. What terrified the nobility most was how the play mutated. No longer confined to stages, it became a shapeshifter. Lullabies taught children the shepherd's anthem with nonsense rhymes masking the lyrics. Tapestries displayed innocent pastoral scenes, unless you knew to follow the embroidered sheep's path to hidden rebel symbols. Even the church's own stained glass wasn't safe. Sunlight streaming through a particular pane in the chapel at noon would project the outline of a broken chain onto the floor. The rebellion had become a game of shadows, and everyone knew the rules except the lords. Then came the adaptations no one expected. A cloister of nuns, forbidden from speaking of politics, staged a miracle play about Saint Agnes resisting her pagan captors, with dialogue lifted verbatim from the banned script. Sheep farmers began tying blue threads to their flocks' collars, a nod to the play's iconic shepherd's banner. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were proof the story had outgrown its origins. The rebellion was no longer about a single performance. It was about who got to control the narrative of power itself, and control, as the lords were learning, was slippery. You could hang an actor, but how do you hang a metaphor? You could burn a script, but not the way a baker's son might smirk while reciting its lines as he handed you your bread. The play's most subversive trick wasn't its plot, it was making people believe they weren't just spectators in someone else's story. They were authors. And once that truth took root, no decree could rip it out by the stems. The censors arrived with ink-stained fingers and suspicious eyes, demanding every line of every script be read aloud for their approval. What they didn't realize was that playwrights had spent lifetimes mastering the art of hiding truth in plain sight. A nativity play might feature a particularly cruel innkeeper who just happened to wear the same fur-lined cloak as the local tax collector. A children's fable about a greedy wolf could mirror recent grain seizures with eerie precision. The censors scratched out anything overtly rebellious, but they missed the symbolism woven into the fabric of the stories. The way a shepherd's lament about lost sheep might rhyme perfectly with the names of villages recently raided by the Lord's men. Artists turned censorship into a creative sport. When authorities banned gatherings of more than 10 people, troops performed for 9 audience members at a time, then repeated the show hourly, the crowd cycling through like a secret assembly line of dissent. Scripts were written in disappearing ink on bread wrappers, eaten by actors if soldiers approached. One infamous performance took place entirely in sign language under the guise of a mime street act, while vendors in the crowd accidentally dropped pamphlets translating the gestures. The rebellion had taught them that art wasn't just about messages, it was about delivery systems. The censors, for their part, grew increasingly paranoid. They banned the color blue after spotting it on rebel banners, only for weavers to dye their cloth in gradients so subtle, the forbidden hue emerged when draped in sunlight. A decree against seditious woodcuts led to an explosion of innocent carvings on church pews until parishioners realized the shadows they cast at certain hours formed the silhouette of a broken chain. This wasn't just evasion, it was artistic jujitsu, using the weight of oppression to throw power off balance. Meanwhile, the descendants of the rebellion's leaders inherited not just stories but strategies. A great-granddaughter of Martin the Red became a celebrated embroiderer, her tapestries depicting idyllic landscapes that, when viewed from across a room, spelled out fragments of the band play in floral patterns. A blacksmith whose ancestor had forged rebel weapons now crafted church bells with carefully tuned imperfections, their discordant notes secretly replicating the melody of a protest song. The rebellion's legacy lived on not in battle cries, but in the quiet mastery of craft, each generation finding new ways to stitch resistance into the everyday. The most astonishing twist, over time, the censors themselves became unwitting archivists of the very ideas they sought to erase. In their meticulous records listing forbidden phrases and suspicious metaphors, they preserved the rebellion's language more faithfully than any rebel scribe could have hoped. Centuries later, historians would mine these censorship logs like treasure maps, piecing together lost verses of songs and fragments of plays from the things some official had nervously crossed out. The irony was poetic. In trying to silence the rebellion, the authorities had given it immortality, and so the cultural war raged on, long after the last rebel had been buried. It moved from stages to sewing circles, from pamphlets to nursery rhymes, its battlegrounds shrinking only to multiply. The lords could lock away the scripts, but they couldn't cage the imagination, and imagination, as it turned out, was the one weapon that grew sharper with use. The fate of the rebellion's leaders reads like a collection of half-remembered ballads, some ending in martyrdom, others in mystery. Martin the Red, the firebrand playwright who turned satire into insurrection, vanished the night the king's soldiers surrounded his hideout. Some say he slipped through a secret tunnel beneath the old monastery. Others swear he walked straight past the guards in a stolen bishop's robe, his face smeared with ash to mimic the pox scars of a dying man. The most enduring legend claims he resurfaced in a bustling port city, teaching acting to street urchins under a false name. His students never knew their ragged tutor had once penned lines that toppled lords, only that his lessons on speaking truth through fiction carried a strange intensity. Not all rebels were so lucky. The butcher's daughter who'd organized supply chains was captured trying to smuggle orphans across the border. They hanged her at dawn, but not before she recited her final lines, not from the shepherd's revolt, but from a lullaby her mother had sung. Even the executioner reportedly hesitated. Others disappeared into the anonymity they'd once weaponized. The dyer who'd stitched coded messages into fabric patterns returned to his vats, his hands permanently stained the rebellion's signature blue. Neighbors whispered he'd wake screaming about the play that never ends, but by daylight he was just another tradesman, his past folded away like a forbidden script. The rebellion's true survival lay in the children raised on its stories. A weaver's widow, her husband killed in the final siege, taught their daughters to weave rebel symbols into bridal trousseaux, a hidden language of resistance passed to new generations. A blacksmith's son, too young to remember the uprising, grew up hearing bedtime tales about the night his father turned plowshares into pikes. These weren't just memories, they were heirlooms polished and adapted with each retelling. When a census taker asked an old woman why her cottage walls were lined with playbills, she smiled and said they were family portraits. Official records, of course, told a different story. Crown historians dismissed the rebellion as a brief disturbance led by rogue entertainers and malcontents. Tax rolls from the era show suspicious gaps where entire villages once stood, not erased but quietly scrubbed from the narrative. Yet the archives betray themselves. A bishop's frantic letter complains of peasants humming a devilish tune during Mass, the same melody from the play's finale. A noble's household ledger lists payments to a jester for moral instruction, a thinly veiled bribe to keep performers from reviving old material. Historians still spar over the rebellion's lasting impact. Traditionalists point to the lack of sweeping reforms, arguing the nobility ultimately regained control. But revisionists note the subtle shifts: how tax collectors suddenly started issuing receipts, how lords began hosting public audiences to air grievances. The rebellion may not have rewritten the laws, but it altered the rhythm of power. Like a play that leaves its audience unsettled long after the curtain falls, it planted questions that couldn't be unasked. Who decides what's just? Who gets to tell the story? And when the performance ends, who truly holds the stage? Perhaps the most telling legacy lies in what happened to the play itself. Banned in every form, it nevertheless resurfaced in fragments. A line quoted in a marriage vow here, a scene reenacted at a harvest festival there. Centuries later, when scholars pieced together a reconstructed version from smuggled letters and oral traditions, they found something astonishing. The rebels had left blank spaces in the script, stage directions reading, improvised here or crowd joins in. It was never meant to be a fixed text, but a living thing, adapting to every new audience. Just like rebellion itself, historians still can't agree whether the rebellion was a spark or a wildfire, whether it truly changed the game or just revealed how brittle the rules always were. Traditionalists dismiss it as a footnote, pointing out that within a generation, taxes crept back up and nobles reclaimed their lands. But revisionists counter with something subtler. The rebellion didn't just win battles, it rewired imaginations. Afterward, lords might still rule, but they did so looking over their shoulders, flinching at every satirical song in the marketplace. The old, unquestioned authority had cracked, and no amount of parchment proclamations could glue it back together seamlessly. The most fascinating debates swirl around the rebellion's cultural aftershocks. Dr. Elena Voss of Cambridge argues in her groundbreaking study that the uprising marked the moment when medieval Europe realized propaganda could flow both ways. Before this, she writes, the church and nobility controlled the narratives through stained glass, through royal decrees. But the rebellion proved stories could be guerrilla tactics, slipping past castle gates in the mouths of traveling players and weavers' rhymes. Meanwhile, Professor Javier Mendez contends it was less about ideas and more about logistics. His research into grain ledgers shows rebel-held villages kept better records than noble stewards, suggesting the real revolution was administrative, proving peasants could govern when given the chance. Yet the most provocative question isn't about the past but the present. Could a play spark a revolt today? On one hand, modern governments have tools medieval lords couldn't dream of: surveillance algorithms, internet blackouts, instant disinformation campaigns. But they also face something far more volatile, a world where viral videos spread faster than scribes could copy pamphlets. We've seen glimmers of it: protesters in Hong Kong borrowing tactics from Les Miserables, activists in Belarus turning folk songs into resistance anthems. The rebellion's true legacy might be the blueprint it left, that when injustice feels inevitable, art can be the crowbar that pries open alternatives. Perhaps the rebellion's most enduring lesson is about scale. It didn't need to topple a kingdom to matter. Like a stone dropped in a pond, its ripples reached further than anyone expected. A weaver who'd once sewn rebel banners might later negotiate a fairer cloth tax. A lord who'd survived the uprising might think twice before doubling the grain levy. And in dimly lit taverns for decades afterward, someone would always know the words to that forbidden song, not because they planned to revolt, but because remembering was its own kind of power. After all, the play's most dangerous idea wasn't rebellion. It was the thought that things could be different, and once that thought exists, it never really disappears. Today's smartphones and social media feeds might seem worlds apart from the torchlit stages of medieval towns, but the heartbeat of resistance still follows the same rhythm. A viral TikTok dance mocking a corrupt politician, a protest anthem that leaps from headphones to street marches, a meme so perfectly sharp it pierces armor-plated authority. These are the modern descendants of the Shepherd's Revolt. The tools have evolved from wooden stages to algorithmic feeds, but the alchemy remains unchanged. Wrap truth in creativity, and suddenly it's contagious. Take the Arab Spring, where YouTube videos of police brutality ignited revolutions, or the way Hong Kong protesters turned Les Miserables into a rallying cry. These moments didn't just spread information, they forged collective identity, just like the medieval play that turned scattered peasants into a chorus of rebellion. The genius lies in the delivery. A dry political manifesto gathers dust, a satirical cartoon slips past censors and lodges in the public imagination. Consider how Pussy Riot's punk performances in Moscow cathedrals borrowed from the same playbook as those medieval actors, using symbolism so potent. Arresting the performers only amplified the message. Yet the digital age brings new paradoxes. A tweet can mobilize millions in minutes, but algorithms can also silence dissent with shadow bans and content moderation. Medieval rebels faced the hangman's noose, modern ones battle algorithmic suppression. When a government bans protest songs, they resurface as lullabies or workout playlists. When satire gets flagged online, it migrates to guerrilla projections on city walls. The battleground has expanded, but the game remains a cat and mouse chase between control and creativity. What the medieval uprising teaches us is that the most potent rebellions aren't just about demands, they're about narrative. Black Lives Matter didn't just protest police brutality. It reframed the story around systemic racism through art, murals, and the sheer repetition of "say their names." Similarly, the Shepherd's play didn't just list grievances, it cast the peasants as heroes in their own epic. That shift in perspective is everything. A hashtag isn't just text, it's a script anyone can adopt. A protest sign isn't just cardboard, it's a prop in a drama where the audience becomes the cast. But here's the cautionary thread woven through this legacy. Culture alone doesn't topple tyrants. The medieval rebellion succeeded because it paired theater with logistics. The actors who knew how to smuggle messages also knew which roads to block. Modern movements falter when viral moments don't translate into sustained action. A meme might dent a dictator's ego, but it takes organized strikes, voter drives, and legal challenges to rewrite systems. The play sparked the revolt, but the revolt required more than applause. Perhaps the most startling parallel is how power now mimics rebellion's tactics. Corporations sell us revolutionary sneakers. Politicians stage photo ops with protest symbolism. The same tools that once exposed corruption are co-opted to sanitize it. This is why the medieval play's legacy isn't just a relic, it's a mirror. It asks us, who controls the story today? When we share a protest video, are we spectators or participants? And when the algorithms feed us endless content, how do we keep our own narratives from becoming just another scrollable distraction? The shepherd's crook has been replaced by the retweet button, but the question remains the same. Will we be the audience or the actors? The curtain's up. The stage is everywhere, and this time the script is ours to write or to swipe past. The rebellion's greatest lesson isn't about the past, it's about the quiet power of the unexpected. Consider how change actually unfolds, not with the bang of a battlefield, but with the hush of a crowd leaning forward in their seats, watching a story that suddenly mirrors their own lives. That's the alchemy of the shepherd's revolt. It didn't just list grievances, it transformed abstract frustrations into a shared script. A manifesto might gather signatures, but a play gathers hearts. When the butcher recognized his stolen wages in the villain's monologue, or the widow saw her eviction notice echoed in a shepherd's lament, injustice stopped being inevitable. It became a role that could be rewritten. Yet for all its triumphs, the rebellion also lays bare a darker truth. Creativity terrifies tyrants precisely because it's so hard to contain. The nobility could arrest actors, but how do you arrest a melody hummed in a wheat field? They could burn scripts, but not the way a child skipping rhyme might preserve a rebel slogan in its nonsense syllables. This is why authoritarian regimes still ban books, censor songs, and jail poets today, not because art is frivolous, but because it's flammable. A single metaphor can become a Molotov cocktail when flung into the right moment. Look closer, though, and you'll spot the rebellion's most cunning survival tactic, its mutability. Unlike a rigid decree or a sworn treaty, stories adapt. The play that began as a biblical parody in one village became a fisherman's ballad by the coast, then a miner's chant deep underground. Each retelling sanded off the edges that authorities could recognize while sharpening the core message. By the time the nobility realized they weren't fighting a single text but 1,000 evolving echoes, it was too late. The rebellion had achieved what all great ideas do. It outgrew its creators. Which brings us to the question hanging over every revolution. How should it be remembered? Not as a fairy tale where the shepherds lived happily ever after, but as a compass. The rebellion's real victory wasn't in toppling a few cruel lords. It was in proving that power isn't a monolith. It's a performance, one that requires our collective suspension of disbelief to sustain. Every time someone quotes the play's lines while bargaining with a tax collector, or hums its tunes while sewing a protest banner, the rebellion isn't history. It's a handbook, so perhaps the best way to honor those medieval actors isn't with statues or plaques, but by recognizing their heirs all around us. The graffiti artist turning a police barrier into a canvas. The teenager live streaming a protest with a song lyric as the caption. Even the meme that makes a dictator the butt of a joke. All are playing the same ancient game of wrapping truth in creativity until it slips past the gatekeepers. The rebellion's final act wasn't performed on a stage. It's the one we're all improvising every time we refuse to let the story end where power wants it to. Every summer when the fields are golden and the air hums with cicadas, the roads leading to the old market square fill with laughter and the scent of roasting chestnuts, just as they did on that fateful night centuries ago. The Rebellion Festival isn't just a historical reenactment, it's a living heartbeat. Locals don handmade costumes, stitching blue threads into their sleeves in homage to the shepherd's banners. Children scramble onto makeshift stages to shout lines from the shepherd's revolt, their voices bouncing off the same cobblestones where the original actors once stood. The climax comes at dusk when torches are lit and the crowd reenacts the march to the castle. Only now, the gates are papier-mâché, and the nobles who surrender are met with cheers instead of pitchforks. It's theater as time machine, collapsing centuries into a single, pulsing moment. At the edge of town where the castle's ruins once loomed, a slender monument of bronze and weathered stone rises from the grass. Engraved along its base are fragments of rebel songs, their lyrics worn smooth by generations of fingertips. Visitors leave tokens, bundles of wheat, tiny crooks carved from wood, as if tending an invisible flame. The monument's centerpiece is a hollow space shaped like a broken chain, designed so that when the sun sets on the solstice, light pours through the gap, casting a perfect, unbroken circle on the ground. It's a paradox in iron and shadow, the rebellion's failure made eternal, yet its ideals still whole. Scholars still pick apart the rebellion's legacy like a knot of tangled thread. At the university in the nearest city, history students debate whether it was a true revolution or a beautiful accident, a spark that caught fire because the tinder of injustice was piled too high. Theater professors stage experimental versions of the play, some setting it in corporate boardrooms or social media echo chambers, proving its themes are eerily portable. Meanwhile, folklorists track how the shepherd's anthem mutated over time, morphing into lullabies, protest chants, and even the rallying cry of a 20th century labor strike. The rebellion's DNA, it seems, is still replicating, yet for all the celebration, there's a whisper of what if that lingers. What if the rebels had held the castle? What if their councils had drafted a constitution instead of scrambling for grain? Local playwrights love to imagine alternate endings, epics where the shepherds forge a republic, or cautionary tales where their utopia collapses under infighting. The most poignant speculation comes from the descendants of rebel families who still farm the same land their ancestors fought for. We got just enough change to taste it, one vineyard keeper muses, like a sip of wine you'll never get to finish. The rebellion's true memorial might not be in stone or song, but in the way it taught ordinary people to see themselves as authors of history. Every time a school teacher compares a modern injustice to the play's villain, or a teenager spray paints a rebel slogan on a train car, the past reaches forward. The nobles thought they were erasing a revolt. Instead, they gave it immortality because rebellions don't end when the fighting stops. They end when the stories do. And this one, it's still being told. What if the rebels hadn't just rattled the nobility's gates, but kicked them down for good? Picture a world where the shepherd's revolt didn't just inspire a rebellion, it rewrote the social contract. No more lords in fur-lined cloaks skimming harvests, no more bishops auctioning salvation, just village councils debating grain quotas under open skies, with former actors drafting laws in the same halls where they once performed satire. It's a tantalizing thought, but would utopia have lasted or unraveled under its own ideals? The rebels' greatest strength, their decentralized creativity, might have been their downfall in governance. Without a single leader, factions would have splintered fast. The Butchers' Guild demanding lower wool tariffs could clash with weavers pushing for flax subsidies. The same street theater that united peasants against tyranny might turn into weaponized farce, with rival troops lampooning each other's policies in the square. And what happens when the blacksmith who once forged rebellion banners gets elected to the grain council, only to hoard wheat for his own forge? Power corrupts, even when it's wrapped in homespun robes. Art's role would have been the most fascinating shift. With no nobles to mock, would plays have turned inward, exposing corruption among rebel officials with the same ferocity they once aimed at lords? Or would creativity wilt without a clear villain? History suggests both. The French Revolution's theaters initially exploded with anti-monarchy dramas, only to face censorship when their critiques turned on the new regime. The rebels might have discovered the cruelest irony, that art thrives on rebellion, not rule. Yet glimpses of possibility shimmer through the chaos. Imagine councils where laws were debated not in Latin, but in rhyming couplets so even the illiterate could understand. Picture tax collectors chosen by lottery, serving one-year terms like actors in a rotating cast. The rebellion's deepest innovation wasn't just challenging power, but reimagining its script. Medieval Europe had never seen democracy, but it knew drama. What if they'd fused the two? The darkest twist, the rebellion's victory might have birthed a new kind of performative tyranny. Charismatic actors turned politicians could manipulate crowds with rehearsed soliloquies, turning governance into spectacle. Elections might devolve into popularity contests judged by applause meters. And when dissent arose, who better to spin propaganda than playwrights who'd mastered emotional manipulation? The tools that toppled oppression can easily rebuild it in subtler forms. This alternate history isn't just fantasy, it's a mirror. Every revolution faces the same pivot. What happens after the cheering stops? The rebellion's true legacy isn't in the castles it stormed, but in the questions it forces us to ask about power's endless encores. Because whether in the 1400s or today, the hardest scene to perform isn't the uprising. It's the morning after. The play that ignited a rebellion centuries ago wasn't just a performance, it was proof that art can be a match struck in the darkness, illuminating paths no one knew existed. Think about it, a handful of actors with makeshift costumes and a script scrawled on butcher's paper managed to unravel the social order of an entire region. That's the alchemy of storytelling at work. It takes the abstract injustice, hunger, despair, and molds it into something tangible, something that can be held up to the light and examined. When those medieval peasants watched the downfall of Lord Wolsey, they weren't just seeing a character, they were seeing their own pain mirrored back at them, and in that reflection they found the courage to rewrite their roles. But here's the twist, the rebellion's true legacy wasn't in the battles won or lost, it was in the way it seeped into the groundwater of culture. Long after the last rebel was hanged or driven into hiding, the play's spirit lived on in lullabies hummed to children, in the way farmers counted their coins with a knowing smirk, even in the nervous glances of lords who'd learned to fear the power of a well-told tale. Oppression relies on silence, on the illusion that things have always been this way and always will be. Art shatters that illusion. It whispers, look. It doesn't have to be like this. Fast forward to today, and the same dynamic plays out in hashtags and viral videos, in protest art slapped onto city walls or hidden in the metadata of memes. The mediums have changed, but the heartbeat remains. A story that resonates deeply enough becomes a weapon. Consider how a single image, a kneeling athlete, a lone protester facing a tank can galvanize movements across continents. Or how a dystopian novel like 1984 surges back into bestseller lists whenever surveillance tightens its grip. These aren't coincidences. They're reminders that the right story at the right moment can bend the arc of history. So the next time you scroll past a political cartoon or laugh at a satirical sketch, pause. Ask yourself, what's simmering beneath the surface? Every joke, every metaphor, every fictional rebellion carries a seed of possibility. The medieval play proved that entertainment and revolution aren't opposites, they're allies. The stage and the street share the same script, and while most stories fade, the ones that matter, they don't just endure, they echo. Now it's your turn. What stories are shaping your world? Could the next great movement start with a tweet, a mural, or a song you'll hear on the radio tomorrow? Drop your thoughts below, and if you've ever wondered how a single idea can topple empires, hit subscribe. We've got more tales where this one came from. After all, history isn't just written by the victors. Sometimes it's written by the playwright.